Corporate governance is precisely the shield that protects a business from collapse.
In Ukraine, corporate governance is still relatively young compared to, for example, Europe.
At the same time, this gives us a greater chance to avoid critical mistakes and not carry inertia forward.
Many believe that corporate governance is currently undergoing a certain transformation. The approach itself is changing.
And what today is not in a state of transformation, there must be a succession policy and there must be high-quality risk management. Ukraine has lost approximately 30% of its human capital. Under these conditions, the role of the board is to ensure business resilience.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Boards of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today our guest is Olga Gorbanovska. Olga is a partner at Ernst & Young in Ukraine.
Hello, Sergey. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, and the topic is extremely important.
Olga, how did you become interested in corporate governance? Was it a natural continuation of your career in an audit firm, connected to corporate governance and corporate governance consulting, or was there some other motivation?
You know, it was a combination of several factors, including personal interest, as this topic has always intrigued me. By nature, I tend to look at the bigger picture. In my work with clients, I have always wanted to look beyond the executive board. In my professional role, I am constantly required to address these issues as well. I regularly engage with supervisory boards on the inherent in the nature of my work. Accordingly, this interest has been developing over the course of 27 years of my career. In addition, it coincided with my constant desire to keep learning. I had a dream. That dream was to study at INSEAD. At one point, when I was reviewing INSEAD programs and deciding which one to choose, I came across an excellent program related to the certification of independent directors, and I decided that this was exactly what I needed. It aligned perfectly at that moment. Interestingly, the timing aligned as well. I was part of the cohort that graduated in the year of the pandemic. That was 2020. We started in a fully in-person format at the Fontainebleau campus, and for the first time completed the program online in a hybrid format, in a hybrid environment. My certification took place precisely when the pandemic began, when COVID started. It was then that I realized it had been the right decision, because corporate governance is truly the shield that protects a business from collapse. At that time, I saw companies failing. One case that particularly struck me involved a large logistics company, which I believe in part due to the absence of a strong supervisory board, lost a significant portion of its business and key clients after abruptly laying off 15% of its workforce at the start of the pandemic and then being unable to cope with demand. It was a very vivid example.
A strategic mistake?
Yes, it was a strategic error. One could say that if there had been a board, it likely would not have allowed management to make such short-term cuts, without considering the long-term consequences, which in reality materialized much sooner than anyone expected. So in 2020, I became fully confident that my choice had been the right one. That certification served as an additional catalyst. It provided a broader perspective and a deeper understanding, as well as many new tools that I now use with great satisfaction and share with both clients and colleagues.
The INSEAD Corporate Governance Center is, in my view, significantly stronger than those at many other business schools or
universities. Interestingly, I initially joined through their Ukrainian program. Nevertheless, I later went to Fontainebleau. It turned out to be a very strong combination because I first tested the program in the Ukrainian context and connected with a large number of my peers, people who share a strong interest in this topic, as well as many clients and many colleagues. I then arrived at INSEAD Fontainebleau well prepared, which made the experience much easier despite the very strong cohort. I was the youngest participant and one of only 4 women among 49 participants in the program. I was indeed the youngest by age. Many participants had 10 to 15 years more professional experience than I did, which added an extraordinary level of insight and wisdom. Learning through interaction with them was an incredible experience. Truly, I am very grateful to my past self for making that decision in time, because I am confident it will be extremely valuable now.
And what is particularly interesting is that in Ukraine, corporate governance in Ukraine is younger than it typically is in Europe, for example. This creates certain nuances related to experience, which can present specific challenges. At the same time, it can also act as a trigger for further development, because both in terms of maturity and long-established governance norms that have been in place globally for decades, we tend to approach them quite critically. We look at these frameworks not only from the perspective of how they can be applied, but also how they can be improved.
I must admit that despite the relatively young stage of corporate governance in Ukraine, we actually have a greater chance of avoiding critical mistakes and not carrying inertia forward. Systems and structures that have been built over decades or even centuries. For example, the banking system are far more difficult to change once an institution has existed for 300 years than to create something new that fully reflects today's realities, simply because there is no need to dismantle legacy systems or to unlearn. In adaptability, and even in how adaptability is measured, one of the most critical components is the ability to unlearn. We do not need to unlearn. We are learning from scratch. We adopt best practices, selecting and tailoring those that fit us and our context, that reflect our realities, without repeating the critical mistakes of more mature systems or carrying them forward. That is our advantage, I'm convinced. And this applies not only to corporate governance.
Yes, many believe that corporate governance is currently undergoing a transformation, the approach itself.
And what today is not in a state of transformation, today there is nothing that is not undergoing transformation.
Absolutely. Artificial intelligence, geopolitical risks, the pace itself, and the acceleration of change across the economic, political, and social environments. All of this is pushing corporate governance toward change. And indeed, we can enter this evolution immediately, not from the initial stage, but already from the next one.
Moreover, we are creating new practices because the conditions in which we currently operate are ones that very few have experienced before. Even the war, which has added a very serious dimension to corporate governance, is shaping board practices in a truly unique way. Practices we do not see in more stable conditions or environments. It forges character.
Absolutely. If we speak about resilience and business continuity, for us, this is truly about survival, not about optimization or advantage. This is the foundation.
It is simply the foundation, not an additional skill or a nice to have, but an absolute necessity without which corporate governance cannot exist. It is a core principle, a baseline.
Olga, you and your company conduct very interesting research related to capital governance. These studies are carried out on a regular basis. Unfortunately, there are not many companies in Ukraine that do this.
We are now planning to launch a new wave. You may recall the first study we launched in 2020. It had only 30 participants and was quite limited in scope. However, it contributed a dedicated chapter to European corporate governance practices and in fact placed Ukraine on the map of corporate governance practices in Europe. This time, we want to make it much more wide-scale. I am therefore very excited about this new wave and will be inviting everyone to participate in the study. Participation will be free of charge and we plan to publish the results quite broadly. We are planning to launch very soon. You invited me at a very timely moment.
And I hope you will not decline when the results are ready.
With great pleasure. I will definitely come to you with the results.
Great, wonderful. You have a truly panoramic view of the corporate governance landscape in Ukraine. In your opinion, what are the key features and characteristics of the composition of boards and their roles in Ukrainian business today, at this very moment?
In fact, the role of boards corresponds to the moment we are living in. We have already spoken about endurance and what we refer to as resilience. This is both endurance and sustainability. I would describe it as resilience, or even anti-fragility, if I may use that term. In my view, the primary role of the board today is to provide geostrategic and geopolitical vision, this level of geostrategic and political literacy, so as not to lose the ability to navigate a landscape that has been sharply constrained and fundamentally transformed, first and foremost by supply chain disruptions and sanctions. These two factors in particular force decision-making that is non-standard, non-traditional, and require very rapid reorientation because the navigation environment is constantly changing. That is the first point. This naturally includes business continuity and crisis management, in other words, geostrategy and geopolitics. It also requires a very strong understanding of what is happening globally from a macroeconomic and geopolitical perspective and how a business organization, or an organization more broadly if it is not profit-oriented, should operate in this context, as well as what alliances should be built, what partnerships are needed, and what kind of ecosystem an organization must create in order to cope most effectively with this landscape. Without an understanding of the landscape, it is impossible. In addition, cybersecurity becomes critical because if we look at what has happened since 2022 to today, cyber threats have increased by between 300 and 400%. A dramatic increase in cyber threats. If we look at the boards of major organizations, especially large state-owned banks, they are required every day to defend their systems against tens of thousands of cyber attacks. This is in fact a situation we have never faced before. In addition, the very rapid development of of artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI and AI-driven misinformation and deepfakes, requires a high level of confidence and competence in the responsible use of these tools. Responsible use includes many dimensions, including the legal and regulatory landscape. As Ukraine plans to harmonize its legislation with EU law, we must clearly understand what is happening there, including the EU AI Act and the broader framework for the responsible use of artificial intelligence. It requires this level of knowledge. So if we bring this entire picture together and add a few more elements, adaptability. We have already spoken about adaptability, the ability not just to respond very quickly, but to react at hyperspeed to any changes that occur. At the same time, it requires holding the big picture while performing a kind of split. On the one hand, seeing the strategic landscape, and on the other, not neglecting the details, because within those details, there may be serious risks if they are ignored. Even from a psychophysiological or neurophysiological perspective, it is counterintuitive to see both the big picture and the fine details simultaneously. This is therefore another critical expectation placed on boards. The role of the board is to combine strategic oversight with detailed navigation, identifying issues that management may have overlooked or missed. This is a complex task. And in addition, ethics, the ethical dimension. Against the backdrop of the war, we have clearly seen the cost of poor ethical decisions. They cost businesses their survival, because ethical governance and change management are fundamentally about the human side of change. Any business at its core is about people. It is no secret that Ukraine has lost approximately 30% of its human capital. In these conditions, the board's responsibility is to ensure business resilience, including through a people-centric approach. So when we bring the full picture together, we see around 7 key dimensions emerging. These include resilience, change management, adaptability and flexibility, risk management, business sustainability, geostrategy and geopolitics, macroeconomics, and the responsible use of advanced technologies. This, I believe, is the overall picture.
So this is quite a broad and complex spectrum.
Which means
Top executives who are currently considering taking the next step toward a non-executive director role are trying to find their place in this market.
absolutely. When I was speaking about all these dimensions and the role of the board, I did not yet address your question about board composition. This follows naturally from the first part of my answer because it is impossible for all of this to be embodied in a single individual. Ideally, an independent director should have at least a foundational understanding of each of these areas while being a true, strong expert at the intersection of 2 or 3 of them. One area alone is no longer sufficient. It is similar to modern orchestras. Playing just one instrument is no longer enough to be in demand. You need 2 or 3. The same applies to independent board members. They must understand all these dimensions, have a solid overall grasp and confidence, but be deeply competent in 2 or 3 key areas.
If we look at the dynamics of boards being dissolved and created since the invasion, at the very beginning we all witnessed many owners cancelling board activity or putting boards on hold. However, approximately 6 months later, another wave emerged, which effectively led to the creation of a significant number of new boards.
That is absolutely true. That was clearly the trend. In fact, there were 2 parallel trends. And I would say that the net effect of these trends resulted in an overall increase of around 15-20% based on my assessment and what I observed, roughly a 15-20% increase in the number of boards. Overall, in addition, boards are changing qualitatively right before our eyes. They are evolving in quality with a growing number of independent members. That is exactly what I wanted to add to the previous question. Since no single individual can embody all of this, we need a board composition that is sufficiently diverse to cover all these areas, where each dimension is represented by deep expertise, and at the same time we have a diverse team that can address everything collectively and still maintain strong chemistry between its members, because decision-making is collective. Solo players can no longer be successful today simply because it is physically almost impossible to survive under such conditions.
And it is dangerous for the company.
It is absolutely dangerous for a company, because even if you have a unique solo player who can lead the company perfectly through all these storms, imagine what happens if something happens to that person. That is it. Collapse. When there is no bench, no backup. By the way, this brings us to another critical role of the board today, especially in Ukraine. Succession. Succession of leaders, succession of executives, succession of both supervisory board members and members of the executive board, the executives. And more broadly, the issue of a talent bench of critical specialists on whom the viability of the business depends.
Unfortunately, we live in a world where we do not know whether we will wake up tomorrow morning.
Absolutely. I will say it frankly, there is no safe place in this world. There truly is no safe place in this world. I would not dramatize it, but indeed no one can be fully certain of anything anywhere, neither here nor in any place that might be considered relatively safe. As my father once said, you can slip in the bathroom or choke on a sip of water.
That is why a succession policy must exist.
And a succession plan as well. Absolutely. There must also be a business continuity plan. That comes first. There must be a succession policy. And there must be high quality risk management. Any decision must, on the one hand, be made quickly and in a timely manner, and on the other hand, be well considered. We must be confident that we have taken data into account and that the data we rely on is of the highest possible quality. We also need to remain mindful of cognitive biases, the typical mental errors we make simply because we are human. This is again a matter of neurophysiology. This is precisely why we need a board, to help protect us from these errors.
How do you view what seems to be a recent global trend toward corporate directors being more hands-on than was traditionally the case?
You know, everything today is more hands-on than it used to be. In the 1990s, for example, a supervisory board was largely a bureaucratic body that stamped documents and released them. Today, boards are genuinely hands-on because we need an additional pair of eyes to review decisions made by executives. And this is normal, and it is right. This is exactly what I was referring to earlier. On the one hand, a supervisory board must see the big picture and maintain a certain distance. It should not be fully hands-on because that risks losing independence and the ability to maintain strategic perspective. However, if the board does not participate in the organization's ongoing work, it will lack timely operational information. On the one hand, the American single-tier governance model, where executives work very closely with the board within a single structure, is extremely fast and efficient. I personally like it less because independence is diluted. I prefer two-tier model. That said, the two-tier model can lose some of its dynamism. I believe flexibility between the two models is essential. The board's role is precisely to maintain this balance between independence and big picture oversight and hands-on involvement in the organization's day-to-day operations. Without a certain level of hands-on engagement, critical turning points can be missed, and correcting that later takes time, which we do not have. And there is one more point. If we look at strategic management more broadly, it has changed dramatically. In the past, strategies were built for 10 years and were considered immovable and monolithic, with execution focused mainly on tracking progress.
We could even have strategic initiatives in place and clearly align everything to them.
And that was it. But what do we have now? Now we work with scenario planning, at least 3 scenarios, and we operate in strategic sprints. So tell me, what does it actually mean to live in a strategic sprint? Yes, you plan for 10 years, but at the same time you plan for 5, for 3, for 1 year, and even for the next 3 months. Your strategic sprints run every 3 months. You adjust them monthly and, if needed, even weekly. That's it. We can't remove this aspect anymore because
this situation
requires hands-on involvement. Yes, it does. And I'm completely calm and comfortable about that. Probably because I've spent practically my entire professional life working in consulting. And we follow the 3-4 pairs of eyes principle. It helps identify mistakes you would never catch if you worked alone. The supervisory board works exactly like that. It's that additional consolidated pair of eyes that really sees the full picture, understands it, and supports the executives. And here I want to caution both owners and executives about the fears related to working with a supervisory board. I often see executives preparing for board meetings as if they're going to war, and sometimes they treat us like a shield. Maybe you could present to the board instead of us or together with us now, because honestly, it's scary. What if they notice something, find an error, see something wrong? But that's exactly what the board is for. The board is the strategic shield of the business. One of our executives once said, "Nothing protects an owner from destroying their own business better than a strong supervisory board."
100%. And by the way, this also raises the question of whether the board is asking for documentation or information in too much detail.
This is a separate issue, a very important one. From my own experience, the better and more carefully the materials are prepared and the more regularly board members work with them, ideally online, continuously, the more effective their oversight becomes. I would recommend independent board members to review the reports at least once every 10 to 12 days because the situation can change very quickly. And once a month, that's absolutely mandatory. Simply keeping track of management reporting because something important can slip through. And the institution of corporate secretaries and the people responsible for preparing and collecting reports is extremely important because the way information is presented and its quality will directly influence the future of the business. So this is definitely not something that can be neglected.
Olga, considering your broad view of the market, to what extent can we say that custom boards, meaning boards somewhere between supervisory boards and advisory boards, are common in Ukraine?
They are quite common because I see, and this is a natural process, that an institution is emerging. Corporate governance is developing gradually, softly, because it's often scary to create a full supervisory board immediately, sometimes simply due to company size. But an advisory board never hurts. I often see how a business starts with one advisor, and then this grows into an advisory body, a small advisory board, sometimes even a family board if it's a family company. And that's actually very useful because there is a whole range of additional issues to consider, especially succession across generations. That is a completely separate, very big topic. And then gradually, or sometimes quickly, the advisory body transforms into a full board if the company has already matured, even if it has not yet reached the stage of a supervisory board. But what I also see is how dynamic this process is. Advisory bodies are gradually turning into fully fledged supervisory boards with independent directors. They are simply being restructured, expanded, and institutionalized. And in my view, this is an excellent trend. It's also a very good way to test this format by first creating an advisory body, because it doesn't trigger as much fear on both sides for executives and for owners. After all, they are advisors, and advisors are there to help, whereas supervisory boards are often perceived as a controlling body. Personally, I would place much more emphasis not on control, but on supporting the long-term sustainability of the business.
There is also the view that not every board that starts as an advisory board necessarily needs to evolve into a supervisory board, meaning that, specifically in the format of advisory boards, they can already create added value and additional strength for the company and the business, and that can be fully sufficient.
Absolutely, yes, it's the very same story here. And I would put it this way. What really matters is looking at what actually works. If a combination of advisors and a fully fledged supervisory board works, that's excellent, especially when they cooperate effectively. If a combination of a family council and several advisors who also sit on the supervisory board works, that's excellent as well. But I would recommend introducing an evaluation of board effectiveness. This is still a topic that is only beginning to develop. We already have regulations. There is a Ukrainian Cabinet of Ministers resolution. There are already practices and tools for this work. But I would carry it out both at the level of the board itself, meaning I would introduce self-assessment, and also involve an independent external perspective, because we can improve only what we measure. Even if we do it not only through quantitative metrics, but also through qualitative ones, we can still assess the process of how the board works as one parameter and its effectiveness over time. I would look at each meeting, then at 1 year results, then at a 2 to 3 year horizon, comparing outcomes with the goals and priorities originally set for the organization, both in terms of financial indicators and non-financial ones. And if we consistently measure both the quality of the process and the results, then we will truly understand which blend, which combination works best.
And that will also allow us to correct mistakes along the way and improve our work. Absolutely.
Any practice, and again, as our professors at INSEAD like to say, there are no best practices. There are good practices, and those good practices are constantly being improved. It's continuous Kaizen. Tomorrow we are 0.5 millimeter, if not a full millimeter, better than we were today. Without this paradigm, there is no point in even starting. Because here it works like this, once in, never out. If you start this process, you don't really step out of it anymore. You don't have the option to completely stop it. You can slow it down, but then there is a risk of slowing down the entire organization. You can move gradually, but just like in coaching, reflection is at work here. Action, reflection cycle. And why does it work everywhere? Because it's human nature. Only through awareness of where we are today and understanding where we want to go can we see the gap between these 2 points and map out the best path forward. Maybe not the simplest path, but the smartest one. Because the simplest is not always realistic in terms of resources, like drilling a tunnel straight through a mountain. Sometimes you can build a railway around the mountain, and sometimes you don't want to go around and you actually have the resources to build a tunnel through the rock. So it's action and reflection, action and reflection. And this is the path on one hand. On the other hand, external benchmarks help us enormously, because when we reflect on comparing ourselves to who we were before and who we want to become, we also have the opportunity to look at our peers, our professional peers. whether at the industry level or sector level practices. And yes, these may simply be good practices that are documented, published, stored in databases, featured in journals and research. Consultants talk about them a lot, as do experts who train independent directors. So it's important simply to stay aware of what's happening and to keep track of metrics both inside the organization and around it. That's how I'd put it.
And this, among other things, probably helps refresh and keep the board's composition relevant on an ongoing basis?
100%, because I would not look at the composition of the board as something fixed forever. Yes, you can freeze it, but should you? Especially if we understand that our business is diversifying. And since we need to introduce a new focus area, why don't we reconsider the current board composition? If we recognize that Gen AI is not only emerging on the horizon, but accelerating so rapidly that we simply cannot afford to wait, then we must immediately start building this expertise. And if you cannot build that expertise with the current board members, that's not a problem. You can invite an external advisor, learn quickly, or bring in someone specialized who already has the required expertise. This is perfectly normal, and it is especially important now to refresh board composition, including because new generations are entering the workforce. New generations of executives are coming in, and they are different. Today, we effectively have 5 generations working side by side, and an interesting trend is emerging. We are again seeing people in their mid-70s returning to work. In fact, a new global trend is the re-entry of 75-year-olds into the workforce. And it's not because they desperately want to work. They are being asked to. Their skills and knowledge can be extremely valuable. At the same time, there is a shortage of well-prepared managers. Again, I'm quoting here, this is not just my personal opinion. The baby boomer generation is often described as one of the most intellectually developed. They learned to calculate and problem solve without technological aids, were capable of a great deal, and demonstrated strong resilience. That is why they are now returning to work in significant numbers, particularly in countries with high life expectancy. Overall, the world's population is aging rapidly. Over the past 10 years, the global population has aged by roughly 5 years. So whether we like it or not, this generation will continue entering the workforce. And boards and executives must understand both this older generation, as well as the 20-year-olds who are radically different, with completely different ideas about life, and everyone in between. When we conduct research today, we look at the employer value proposition through the lens of all 5 generations. And the same applies to customers, because anyone can be a customer. And if a business does not exist for its customers, if there is no one it serves, then the organization loses its reason to exist.
I've come across recommendations that boards should also reflect all 5 generations. But how realistic is that?
It's difficult, but we are beginning to see movement in this direction. There is now a trend toward rejuvenating boards and making them more generationally representative. It's not only about gender diversity anymore, but also generational diversity. Increasingly, organizations are considering younger candidates for board roles. Previously, if you were under 50, you were filtered out automatically. The assumption was you lacked sufficient life and professional experience. Today, that trend is reversing. On the contrary, to understand innovation, what customers from different generations expect, what employees need, and what is required from future leaders, boards need voices from different age groups. So you need appropriate representation on the supervisory board. I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years we see very young members joining boards, not children, of course, but people who are very young by traditional board standards.
The challenges businesses face today often place top management and boards in situations where prior experience and solutions simply don't work anymore.
Absolutely. This is again about the ability to unlearn quickly, because sometimes old knowledge and old skills, if not adapted carefully, can actually become harmful, especially when they are applied dogmatically. Do it the way we've always done it, and everything will be fine. No, that approach no longer works. Experience is valuable when it helps us adapt to new realities. Experience matters when it helps us navigate crises, adjust course, and continue learning. This is extremely important. The ability to unlearn them and then relearn them is critical, and the willingness to do so matters most. It's similar to digital literacy. There is a great concept called digital dexterity. It combines 2 elements, both capability and motivation. In other words, it is essential to both have the skills and the desire to learn, and to continuously master new things. When both capability and motivation are aligned, that intersection creates the ideal foundation for boards.
We also understand that the gender balance in Ukraine will look different than before the invasion. On one hand, many people, primarily men, unfortunately, will not return from the front. On the other hand, many who left abroad may not come back to Ukraine.
This is a painful issue, not only for supervisory boards, but for the country as a whole. These demographic shifts and losses will be very difficult to recover from. But regardless of whether we are talking about Ukraine or any other country, diversity on boards is essential. If organizations exist to serve people, then both genders must be represented, even if not evenly, because they are represented in society. A large share of any organization's customers, consumers, users, or stakeholders are both women and men. If women are not represented on the board, we lose a significant segment of the audience. And we fail to truly understand that audience. I often recall the story of the first voice-activated car. The company that first launched a voice-activated car actually lost 2 years on the market. The development team was entirely male, and the cars responded only to men's voices. They wouldn't start when women spoke. As a result, they lost their niche because they couldn't adapt quickly enough. Their development team simply hadn't considered it. Test cars simply did not start when women tried to use voice commands. Even this simple example clearly demonstrates why women are needed on boards. And any statistics confirm this. Take the McKinsey research, which shows that businesses with diversity on their supervisory boards are, on average, 21% more profitable than those without such diversity. That is why Europe began introducing quotas. But quotas are a complicated story. They can be useful at the beginning, but we absolutely don't want them to turn into another box-ticking exercise, where anyone is appointed, regardless of skills and qualifications, simply because they are the right gender. That approach is exactly what we do not need. Believe me, we have more than enough highly qualified women. I am a member of 2 communities, women leaders for Ukraine and women on boards. There are so many leaders there, more than enough to fill any number of boards. The challenge is that sometimes their aspirations, business opportunities, and market needs don't align. Sometimes supply and demand simply don't meet. They exist in parallel. But this can be harmonized. Women are needed on boards, supervisory boards, boards of directors, advisory boards, everywhere. Women are needed in top positions because without them, businesses risk overlooking critical aspects required to adapt products, services, and outcomes.
So the question is, do real objective barriers exist for women in Ukrainian companies who want to build their careers?
These barriers have always existed in various forms. There is still the glass ceiling elements of patriarchal culture, inertia, and historically male-dominated business environments. Fortunately, in Ukraine, in my view, these barriers are not as severe as in many other countries, if we look globally. According to International Labour Organization research, Ukraine ranks 25th in the world in terms of equal opportunities for women out of 150 countries. Being 25th from the top is not bad at all. Although today in Ukraine, women make up roughly 18-25% of board members. Globally, according to Standard & Poor's, the figure is around 34%. So yes, we are somewhat behind, but the barriers are unconscious bias, conscious bias, legacy practices, inertia, gentlemen's clubs, and traditionally male-dominated industries. And yes, there are sectors where men still dominate because the work is physically demanding, simply because the work is physically hard, and it may genuinely be difficult for women. For example, welding underwater pipelines in heavy diving suits. That is extremely challenging work for women, and yet women are still present even in these fields. Look at metallurgy, telecommunications, even at the CEO level, including here in Ukraine. I cannot name companies for reasons of confidentiality and advisory independence, but believe me, there are many excellent examples. Women lead businesses even in the toughest sectors, deliver strong results, and give companies new momentum. These barriers can absolutely be broken. But first and foremost, the woman herself needs to have the desire to do so. And today in Ukraine, it can be very difficult for women to cultivate that ambition because they carry so much responsibility. They care for families, parents, children, and manage their work. Sometimes it is about basic survival. Many roles traditionally assigned to women since prehistoric times are still present, while men historically focused on a narrower set of tasks. And genetically, we have not changed as much as we think. Only 2 elements in our genome have changed since we began walking on 2 legs. Meanwhile, the world around us has transformed dramatically. Physiologically and neurophysiologically, we are almost the same, so barriers still exist. Physical, neurological, social, psychological, and of course, the burden of war. But for the women who truly want to lead in corporate governance or executive management, I am confident they will find their voice. And for owners who want true representation on their boards, they need women. Ideally, at least 40% of the board should be women. At that point, things begin to work. It's enough to dilute the men-only club.
Given the demographic shifts we are facing, without bringing women into top management, onto boards, and without broader attention to women's leadership in general, the prospects for business development in Ukraine look highly uncertain.
I also see another barrier here. I work extensively on leadership development, including corporate leadership and executive leadership. And I consistently observe that imposter syndrome affects women more often than men. This pattern has roots in the post-Soviet period, and frankly, it's not only a post-Soviet phenomenon. Overall, women tend to rate themselves lower than men do. They are more self-critical. Historically, they have been conditioned to view themselves this way, and they often feel they are not enough. This is backed by data. I've been working in this field since around 2005, and over 20 years I've gathered my own empirical statistics. Women need to recognize that they are enough and that you don't wait until you are 100% or 150% ready. If you meet 70 to 80% of the requirements, you can already step forward. Don't be afraid. Fear itself plays a huge role here. This fear of I'm not enough becomes a barrier. Once it's overcome, everything changes. And men as mentors are extremely important in this process. I personally benefited greatly from male mentors because in my corporate environment, there were always significantly more men than women. In our management teams as well, women account for roughly up to 40%. If a woman wants to overcome this fear, the first step is working on herself. Reading Brené Brown is extremely helpful in this regard. She has several excellent books that I strongly recommend, especially for women who want to make peace with their inner critic. Sponsorship and mentorship also matter, both from successful women who have already worked through these fears and found balance, because they can truly support this process. And it doesn't mean the fear ever disappears completely. It doesn't. Fear is always present. The real question is, what do you do with it? Brené Brown's book, Dare to Lead, is exactly about learning to live with fear and move forward anyway.
So, could we recommend that top managers, particularly women, consider developing their careers toward non-executive director roles?
Absolutely. I believe this path is in many ways naturally aligned with women, especially for those who want to balance work and life. With a portfolio of board roles, you're not tied to the operational machine. When you are an executive, your reality is in practice 24/7, 365 days a year. And if you're a business owner, taking a real vacation is just as difficult. In a supervisory or non-executive board role, you can build a portfolio of boards. Of course, it still requires involvement, especially with a more hands-on approach becoming the norm. But you can gradually build this portfolio. Start with one board, then as you become more comfortable with the process, expand to 2 or 3, depending on whether you remain an executive elsewhere, how intensively you want to work, and how much time you want to devote to your hobbies, your family, and other parts of your life. But this is, without exaggeration, extremely interesting. If I go back to the beginning of our conversation, why did I personally start looking in the direction of supervisory board? Because I understand that sooner or later I will also reach that stage. Retirement or stepping away from executive roles when I get tired of being an executive. Or when I want something different, I will move into a portfolio of supervisory board roles. Why is this appealing? Because it is not just one single company, but several different companies. And that is far more interesting, like a kaleidoscope, than focusing on one company for 3, 4, or 5 years and eventually wanting a change. So, unquestionably, in my view, this is work that is interesting, valuable, and extremely important.
Based on your broad perspective on corporate governance, would you recommend that business owners establish boards at this stage? Because there are certain beliefs among owners that hold them back in this direction. For example, the perception that it is expensive or that it only pays off in the long term and so on.
It is far more expensive to lose a business due to a small mistake or some form of oversight. And such oversight can occur even simply because of neurophysiology. There are 16 basic personality types, and each of us represents only one of them. Imagine that there are 15 other perspectives you simply cannot see due to your own neurophysiology. You are not able to see the full picture. Gallup research shows that out of the 25-30 potential strengths a person may have, an individual, as a human being, can typically develop no more than 5. Everything else simply cannot be. This is because strong neural connections are formed from childhood, and sustainable success must be built on strengths, but the remaining 20 areas that are not strengths still need to be covered somehow. That is why it becomes far more costly if you lose out, because your executive team was selected in your own image. As a rule, when building a team, it is much easier to communicate with people who share your own psychotype, and decisions tend to favor those who are similar to you. This may seem counterintuitive, but you need to look toward those who are different from you. Because those very people, although they may feel uncomfortable, challenging, or even adversarial, are precisely the ones who allow you to see the rest of the spectrum of issues that you would never see on your own. So this is not just important, it is essential. You do not necessarily need to establish a fully fledged supervisory board right away. Start at the very least with advisors. One, or better yet, more than one, and those advisors should not be friends of the owner. This is a trend I have clearly observed during the war. Previously, advisory boards often consisted of the owner's friends, and the outcome tends to be exactly the same. Who are our friends? They are people who are close to us, whom we understand at a glance, which usually means they share our psychotype. What we need are people who are different from us in industry, gender, age, experience, psychotype, and sometimes even culture. Because if we want to enter new markets but do not understand the cultures of those markets, we will simply fail. So start with 1, 2, or 3 advisors who are not close to you, neither family nor friends. This must be a professional relationship, otherwise you are taking a very significant risk. The risks are high. Of course, one can choose to carry these risks, but they may ultimately lead to the loss of the business as a whole, because someone else will be faster and someone else will be more compelling. Why am I so confident about this? I became convinced of it, among other things, through my own executive education program. We witnessed this very clearly when an actual experiment was conducted with our cohort. First, we all went through individual testing. We were then given a task to decide what items would be essential to survive a 50-day crisis scenario. Adrift on a raft in storm conditions with nothing left. What should you have with you? It was a relatively simple, yet at the same time very complex task. Each of us first solved it individually. Then the 49 participants were divided into 6 groups. We did not know the criteria at the time, those were explained to us later. One group consisted of people with virtually no understanding of survival. Another group consisted of top-level survival experts. These represented the 2 extreme poles. In between, there was a group composed exclusively of male experts. There were also 2 groups of mid-level participants, different from each other, but with an average level of knowledge. They had some understanding of the topic, but they were not top-tier specialists. We were then given the exact same task again. This time, we solved it in a supervisory board format. Everyone was surprised by the results in terms of outcome quality. The 2 mid-level groups performed best. I happened to be in one of them, but it was collective intelligence that truly won. So even a group of top-tier experts with real-life experience, professional backgrounds, former Marines who knew exactly how to survive, collectively arrived at a worse decision. Then a diverse group of people who had a reasonable but not exceptional understanding of the topic, yet came together and, through a proper decision-making process, produced a better outcome. Therefore, fortunately or unfortunately, solo players, even top performers, do not guarantee success or optimal results. A board, on the other hand, significantly increases the chances of success, even if it is a small one. Start with 3 to 5 members. Let it be an advisory body, but in this way you will test both your own biases and those of your executive team, and simply gain an additional perspective on the situation. You may say that this requires extra time, and that is true, but if you select the board correctly and it is dynamic, you will gain far more than you lose.
Olga, thank you very much.
Thank you for such deep questions. Each of them could easily take half an hour to answer.
Thank you very much for participating in the program, for such an engaging conversation, and for very valuable insights.
We will stay in touch. This is not a long goodbye. We are launching the research, already visualizing the results, and will continue the discussion once the findings are available.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you in the next episodes.